Welcome to the Cannabis Review. We've got a great show lined up for you today. I'm very pleased to announce that our guest is one of the leading experts in medical cannabis in Ireland, Mr. James Linden. James, how you doing? Are you well?
I'm doing very well, Owen. Thank you.
Excellent. Great to hear. So thanks very much for coming on the shows.
My pleasure. So
you've had an exciting little last week or two. Seems to be some great news for Greenlight Medicines.
Yeah, it's been an exciting few months, really, working through the process, getting to know our new colleagues in Germany, and getting some decent finance, behind us to move forward some of the projects that we've been working on, over the last pretty much 5 years now that we started, properly researching in UCD. First PhD student in cannabis was actually in Ulster University. But around the same time, we launched a few projects. So yeah, it's nice now that we're able to kind of move into, for me, the more interesting kind of mechanism of action work around the disease process and things like that. Stuff that, doesn't really get talked about too much, the boring science. But yeah, so it's going to give us like such opportunity to really drive that forward and create interesting drugs and drug delivery devices and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's been fun.
Well, I think it's great to see an Irish company doing business the likes that you guys have done recently. So I'm going to kind of get straight into topic one that I think a lot of the viewers are going to be interested to know about in terms of the legal issues and the current state of play in Ireland. How do you see the current state of medical cannabis in Ireland at the moment?
Okay, so this is one that's contentious for so many people. I've witnessed and watched it, progress over the last, particularly 5 years that I've been directly involved. I was quite shocked about 3 years ago when the Irish government announced that they were gonna have a legal medical cannabis system. That kind of took me a little bit by surprise. So I saw that as excellent progress and was really excited, hopeful, all our dreams had come true for all these thousands of patients that had already identified themselves to me in that short space of time. And then it just seemed to just go on a bit of a go slow. It's not the most important thing. It's never the most important thing. It's just too hard to figure out because of the legalities, because of all the vested interests, especially in our country, of paramilitaries and whatever else is going on. So everyone's a bit afraid of it, but the reality is there's just thousands of people across the island using it. It needs to progress. I see, small positive progress, but it could be faster. I think that's probably where I lie on that.
Yeah, I think everybody within the cannabis industry could agree that things are moving at a snail's pace, and whether it's the lack of education between the politicians or the will to learn about this exciting new industry, I think only they can answer for themselves. Hopefully we'll get one of the politicians on this show one of the days to be able to explain what the delay is, why so many patients aren't allowed access to products, why there's 7 or 8 different diseases that are allowed access and a multitude of others aren't. It seems like a bit of a harebrained way to be doing things.
What's interesting, Owen, is that while they started out with naming 3 indications, kind of the treating the side effects of chemotherapy and cancer, retractable epilepsy, and an MS type thing, there are actually doctors in Ireland now prescribing for chronic pain as well. And I think it's important that people know that, and that they don't think that they can't get a prescription for pain. There have been many ministerial licenses approved for pain. And I think that that's probably the thing that most people are using cannabis for anyway. And that it's probably important that people in Ireland know that they can approach their doctors to get prescriptions for pain. The products after that, that's where it gets a little bit complex.
Yeah, well, I think that there was a lot of people who wouldn't be aware of the fact that I think chronic pain is one of the issues that can be now treated for medical cannabis. I think it's such a varied issue that there's so many people in the world that have some sort of chronic pain in their life that I think it was one of the fundamental ailments that needed to be included in any good medical cannabis industry over here. As he said, the products being created to treat the patients over here, I think is another big issue that the government needs to look at and provide funding for specific companies to be able to get into this new industry. What are your thoughts on that?
don't know. Can you repeat that last bit again? Sorry,
So it's more the government needs to, I think, kind of step up and assist the industry and maybe provide funding for some of the big companies like yourselves or some of the other exciting companies that are looking to develop products for the consumer themselves, as opposed to having to ship in some inferior products.
Yes. So there's a lot of really positives that have been going on as well in regards to government supports, but there's just still a few stumbling blocks, it seems. So we've done really well in funding from the Irish Research Council and from Science Foundation Ireland, based on some of our research projects that we want to do. Where we've struggled is with Enterprise Ireland, because anything to do with cannabis, apparently they can't touch it because the board says they can't, even though it's legal in this country, even though we have some of the top cannabinoid researchers in the world in this country. The head of the cannabis or cannabinoid research kind of international association thing is Professor David Finn in Galway, who it's very frustrating.
I can sense your frustration through the camera, and I think we hold the same level of frustration. Something that I'd like to move on to next, something that we were talking just before we came on, is the medical research that you're doing in cannabinoids and other plant molecules happening in UCD and UU. Could you explain a little bit to the audience what you're doing there?
Yeah, for sure. So Greenlight, while we started out looking at cannabinoids, because they were, highly interesting and attractive and, therapeutic, we always had our eye on other plant molecules and other plants of interest. And recently with a company in Northern Ireland called Hughes Mushrooms, who are, a really, really big mushroom company, supply loads of big, supermarkets in the UK and stuff like that. But they also have a very innovative and interesting arm looking at molecules from medicinal mushrooms with a view to creating, active pharmaceutical ingredient, kind of standard, drugs from those type thing. So we licensed a drug from them recently, which comes from shiitake mushrooms. And I say a drug, it's, fairly pure, like 99%-ish sort of isolate of a particular polysaccharide that has been, indicated in some types of cancer and also in some viral, and has some kind of antiviral properties. So over the last while, of course, viruses have been going, taking over everybody's minds. And, we realized there may be an opportunity to see, does this help? This drug has been used previously in HIV and hepatitis with some success. And so we're actually moving that into a little clinical trial, and probably based in Manchester, if this second wave thing really hits. I know we're seeing lots of cases and all, but I mean, prevalence of disease. Then we will, we have enough product, we have protocols ready to go to roll out this trial, which is quite interesting. But we actually licensed the drug because we were interested in its anti-cancer properties. So we're doing cancer research at UCD with Antoinette Perry and William Gallagher in UCD Conway and in the science building as well. So this was something that we were going to put in there, along with some of the cannabinoids and other molecules we were already looking at in different cancer cell lines and stuff like that, to try to figure out what they're doing, where they might be effective targets for cancers and all that kind of thing. So this mushroom molecule was bound for there, but has been slightly distracted by the virus, like the rest of us. So that's the first of many interesting mushroom molecules that are in development, and that's the first that we've licensed from the guys. And there are a few more interesting ones in the pipeline. So yeah.
Excellent. One thing that kind of came to my mind as you were talking there, for some of the young viewers who are watching this, who maybe want to have a career in science and research in cannabinoids and other plant molecules, which college do you recommend? I obviously know you're working with UCD and UU. Is there a specific course, or is there any advice that you'd give to young people who are maybe starting their first year of college after a horrendous year that they've had so far? I'm sure there's a lot of kind of kids who are going to have a more interest in this field now after this big event that's happened this year. So would there be any little tips or advice that you'd give for any of them starting off?
The most interaction and connectivity that I've had has been in UCD, like by a mile. There's like a whole raft of researchers doing different projects around hemp and cannabis at the minute. Other universities have them as well, but there's something about what's going on with UCD, I guess, probably driven a bit by our own presence there over the last 4 or 5 years. What type of backgrounds are people coming from into cannabis? Like everything. Meeting people from banking and finance, and because we need all those things as well in the businesses that need to be run as businesses. But for like careers researching and that, probably something like neuroscience or pharmacology. If it's the kind of research that I'm into, that kind of tickles me a bit, then it would be maybe more biochemistry based or neuroscience.
Okay, excellent. So next topic that I kind of wanted to talk to, something that we'd mentioned before, is the brain organoids project that you're currently working on. Can you explain to the audience what exactly this is?
Yes, kind of. So one of the reasons that I left research science 16 years ago was because at the time I was working on Alzheimer's, and one of the things you do when you're working on Alzheimer's is you kind of cut up animals and analyze their brains and look at different proteins and DNA, genes, and blah blah blah, all this stuff, right? And I just found that there wasn't, for me who'd done a PhD that didn't involve any animals, I just found this was kind of barbaric and didn't necessarily translate to what goes on in the human. Plus, Alzheimer's was a really difficult thing to research anyway. Nobody was really making any progress. But so bring that forward many years later. I went off and kind of went into pharma and sales for years, and then bring that back to now that I'm actively researching. Well, other people are actively researching within our group of companies. So I met some researchers at UCD that had been building these organoids. Essentially, organoids are basically take like stem cells from humans. You can take them from skin samples and reverse them into stem cells, and then you make like a kidney, or now we've moved on to brains. So we're making these mini brains that have different neuronal cell types. I think from the presentation I looked at last week, I think there's about 16 different neuronal cell types or subtypes. I hope that my partners in this aren't watching. So, but there's also kind of semi-defined regions of these tiny little brains as well. So it's kind of like doing the idea of tissue culture, where you grow cells, in 2D, essentially one layer of cells. This is like 3-dimensional tissue culture. We're actually creating sort of functional little brains. But the cool thing about the brains is that if I took your skin cells and grew up a brain, the brain would have your sort of conditioning, Let's say you had epilepsy, let's say you had been addicted to drugs, it would hold the kind of epigenetic memories and different things, associated with that, right? So in essence, one of the first projects that we did on something we're talking about later in the psychedelic research was we got some mini brains addicted to cocaine.
As you do.
And then after the mini brains were addicted to cocaine, we then treated them with a particular tryptamine psychedelic, and and we were able to see the same reversals of different kind of protein expression that were witnessed in the same animal work that's been done with cocaine addicted rats. So it's kind of cool. We were able to verify that instead of using rats, which I just fundamentally against, but sometimes it has to be done because of all of the kind of all the different benchmarks and limitations set out by FDA and the European Medicines Agency, etc. Right? So it has to be done at some point. But hopefully in the future, we can do a lot of this work in human organoids, where we're actually seeing, what happens to Owen's brain when we give him this drug. Sorry, another step beyond just using these as an alternative for, killing rats and mice and whatever, is we could actually to do personalized medicine. So if you had a particular condition again, we could grow up 100 of Owen's mini brains and hit them with different combinations of antidepressants or drugs or whatever, and see which are most suitable, potentially. So
Wow.
that's fun.
That's highly interesting, mate, and I'd love to basically touch base with you maybe in the next few months and a year and get an update on that work. It kind of brings me into the very last segment.
You just paused there.
Coming up, and this is the new world of psychedelics for medicine.
Talk
to me all about how you're getting into this and everything. You work away. So there's James.
Apologies.
Not at all. So as we were saying, that exciting new world of psychedelics for medicine. Talk to me about all the work you guys are doing here.
Ooh, so this was actually the first thing that I ever got funding for to research in Ireland back 5 years ago. We got funding from the Irish Research Council to look at the properties of, again, certain tryptamines in the process of addiction. And this was based on some work that I had kind of witnessed and seen in the real world, and through friends, etc., who had been addicted to cocaine and alcohol and all sorts of different things, and were using particular compounds to come off those drugs. So me being curious, wanted to see how real that was and how applicable that might be, in the boring pharma sense. Like there's a lot of people out there working with these compounds, kind of under the radar, having to keep themselves, on the down low and all because of legalities, which is a terrible shame. But I was considering, right, okay, that's great. Those people can help, a small amount of people, but how do we get it into what I consider as the emerging paradigm, where herbal medicines have kind of morphed with pharma. So as pharma gets its ass kicked by everybody who kind of hate it now, let's face it, it has to do something with all its personnel and its distribution networks, and it has the most incredible, people who really truly believe that the job they're doing is helping people. And all of these pharma companies, like, even if they're making thalidomide or whatever, they think that, this is, they're paying my salary and we're helping people. So they're brilliant people, just a little bit unaware maybe of the damage that's being caused. But what's happening now is, even like I saw a deal there last week that MediPharm had done a deal with Stada.
I saw that.
So Stada, were quite big in Ireland, through Clonmel Healthcare, selling generic drugs and that. So it's really starting to morph. Tiva were doing some deals on inhalers in Israel and all this stuff, so it's the morphing has happened, and hopefully, the good products that all of the kind of cannabis community has created can be sensibly, affordably, fairly, scaled and put into those distribution channels of doctors prescribing drugs, pharmacists and whatever dispensing them, whatever way it has to be, like. But yeah.
I saw the inhaler system, the distribution method that was invented there in Israel. It looks like a genius idea, I have to admit. Have you come across Red Light, the company who have started a microdosing system?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Yeah, what's your thoughts on this new product? Because I think you'll have a lot of consumers who, let's say, might be partial to psilocybin and it might be part of their routine. Having a product come to market that actually allows them to take it on a daily basis, I think, is that a lot of people would like. Whether it's going to deliver on what it's saying, I think, is another thing. What would your opinion on that one be?
So so Red Light Holland, I know some of the people kind of that set that up. They came from the cannabis world. That's one of Bruce Linton's kind of new babies in the psychedelic space. So these are essentially, big banking plays, and I don't know how much of it will play out. I hope that it's true, and I hope that a lot of these things are true. There's a lot of the kind of Toronto Stock Exchange movement at the minute around psychedelics, and we've seen it before. We've seen Nuvera, we've seen all these projects happen in the cannabis thing already, and I would wonder when I see companies moving and setting up in places where they think it's legal or where they're going to get some allowance to do it. For me, it's a slightly flawed business model. Like, you're getting companies, I won't name them all, but moving to Jamaica or to Dominican Republic or to Holland, because somehow that makes a model, but it only gives you a very, very small population to work with who live in that jurisdiction, and people then will have to travel there, right? The idea of microdosing itself, yeah, brilliant. I've only experienced it a small bit. I'm more of a macro person. But yeah, like, whatever helps people, it'd be brilliant if it could be rolled out. I think that probably the boring pharma route for psilocybin has already been initiated and has happened with Compass Pathways and their recent IPO on the NASDAQ and the huge funding that's gone into complete that phase 3 trial. Now, that's not a microdose either. That's actually quite a big dose. It's like 20 milligrams. So of psilocybin, which is like kind of 2.5 grams of Liberty Caps Irish.
Okay, that's a nice old dose.
It's a nice old dose. But the success that Compass Pathways have had in lifting people out of treatment-resistant depression has been unreal. I remember first seeing this data about 3 or 4 years ago. David Nutt and Robin Carhart-Harris were presenting it, the Imperial College guys, and do all the psychedelic research. And it was like 12 people went into the trial, treatment-resistant depression, which meant that cognitive behavioral therapy hadn't worked, nor had the 3 of the gold standard drugs. Something like that were roughly the criteria. For long periods of time, the drugs still hadn't worked. So these people went in, had their 2.5 gram dose, and after 12 weeks, 6 of them were still clinically not depressed. Okay. Most of them reacted positively. I think only like 2 of them didn't have a reaction or didn't report positivity. And that was 1 dose. So could you imagine if somebody was able to take a dose of psilocybin every month that had depression, So that's why there is so much interest in this, because the depressed world is on the internet. The depressed world is on the internet going, how the hell can I do something different? How can I empower myself and take this medicine or put it in my own hands? Or let's try what all the celebrities in Hollywood are talking about, because they're all microdosing as well. And like, I'm just coming across people all the time now who are growing mushrooms. I know more people growing mushrooms than I know people growing cannabis. Nearly,
yeah.
No, that's an exaggeration.
I think it is one of those worlds that there's. I remember somebody in a big investment firm saying that it's going to take them 2 years to do what they did in psychedelics, what it took 10 years or 5 years to do in the cannabis industry. I think because there's no stigma really involved around mushrooms. It's not portrayed as something illegal and dirty like cannabis seems to have been done over the number of years. So I can see the legislation, let's say, and the funding for that industry happening at a far greater rate than it happens in cannabis. With that being said, what would be your 2 or 3 companies that you'd have hopes for that would enter into this space in Ireland? Irish companies now that may be getting ready to, apart from yourselves, obviously, who are leading the way at this?
Irish companies in the psychedelic space?
Yeah, any young, let's say, we all know, let's say we were talking about the CBD manufacturers beforehand. Is there anybody that we can promote, that we can kind of give a little tip of the cap to, who's working with just the psychedelics and psilocybin, that isn't a cannabis company that's decided, oh, let's just jump into this psychedelics world as well, because it seems to be the same principle, which we both know it's a completely separate industry and sector?
I know a few people that are, interested in that space, but they're not kind of commercializing their ideas yet.
They're sitting back and waiting.
But again, I think what happens a lot of the time with these ideas is the first people that try to commercialize such an idea, you know, they're not necessarily ones that we want to rush and flock to support. You know, but different if they're great. What I'm finding is there's an interest, you know, I'll just talk globally here, right?
Yeah.
So there's an interest among people definitely in growing cacti, growing mushrooms, in hosting and facilitating you know, workshops with those. And I don't know, and also people interested in, you know, making, you know, doing sustainable projects around, you know, all these wonderful plants. So there's loads of great folk doing stuff in Ireland. I don't really know what I want to say.
Yeah, no, that's totally acceptable. We won't put you on the spot there with that one. But I think it's been a hugely informative chat so far. I think that's all the time we're going to have. If anybody wants to learn more about Greenlight Medicines, you can see their website is below. Feel free to visit. James, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, mate. The best of luck with everything in the future, and we will be keeping an eye on everything here at the Cannabis Review. And as I said, hopefully we'll touch base in a couple of months and get an update on all the great work that you're doing.
Thanks, Owen. Cheers.
Thanks everybody for watching. We'll be back in a couple of days with a chat with Oscara, the first cannabis investment fund in Ireland, based out of Ireland. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned.